Hello, let's talk a little bit about clauses versus phrases. A clause contains a subject and a verb, and there are two kinds, independent clause and dependent clause. So you can probably imagine the independent clause can stand on its own as a sentence, and you can see what I put here. An independent clause makes sense as a sentence. For example, the girl ran. Girl is the subject, ran is the verb. This makes sense as a sentence. It is a complete thought. They can also be bigger and still contain that one complete thought. For example, the sweet girl in my British literature class ran across campus to help her fallen friend. The subject and verb are the same. Girl ran. But you see, sometimes you have lots of words that can help add to the sentence. It's still one independent clause and still just as much of a sentence as the girl ran. But it's the dependent clauses that don't make sense even though they have a subject and a verb. For example, when the girl ran, even though you have a subject and verb, girl ran, it doesn't make sense to say when the girl ran, you are expecting more to have that complete thought. Dependent clauses are identifiable because they usually start with a subordinating conjunction. Subordinating conjunctions are words like when and if and since and although and even though. Those kinds of words start dependent clauses. If you take this when out, you have the girl ran, which is an independent clause. So you can see the subtle difference between independent and dependent clauses, but you cannot say when the girl ran is a sentence unless you have some help. And that help can come in the form of adding an independent clause. I have put on this slide the different kinds of sentences and what they have to do with these independent and dependent clauses. The simple sentence is just one independent clause. The girl ran was a simple sentence. And even the longer sentence that had more than just the girl ran, that was still just one independent clause. But when you have a dependent clause, one way you can make it a sentence is just to add an independent clause. For example, as I entered class, that has a subject and a verb. I entered, that is a dependent clause because as I entered class doesn't make a complete thought. It starts with a word like as, which is a subordinating conjunction. You need more than just as I entered class. Of course, you can add an independent clause to have it make sense. As I entered class, I saw a girl run past me. That is an independent clause at the end. That is a dependent clause at the beginning. That's a complex sentence. That's when you have an independent and a dependent clause. Now, technically, you can have more than one dependent clause for a complex sentence. You don't see it that often, though. Here's another example of a complex sentence. I saw a girl run past me as I entered class. I have just flip-flopped the independent and dependent clauses here. The independent comes first, the dependent comes second. Notice the difference in punctuation. When the dependent clause comes first, you have a comma after the dependent clause. But that's rarely the case when you have the dependent clause coming second. Just something to note. But these are complex sentences because they have an independent and a dependent clause. What if you have two independent clauses put together? Then you have a compound sentence. For example, the girl ran past me is an independent clause. I followed her up in the hall is an independent clause. In this case, you connected them with a comma fanboys conjunction. Now, a fanboys conjunctions are for and nor, but, or, yet, so. This could have just as easily been two sentences. The girl ran past me, period. I followed her up the hall, period. But it is very common practice to connect the two independent clauses with a comma fanboy. You see, this is also something you could do with a semicolon. The girl ran past me, semicolon. I followed her up the hall. And truthfully, it could be any of the three ways that you connect independent clauses, with a semicolon, with a comma fanboy, or with just making it two sentences in the first place. Most people probably put comma fanboys to connect independent clauses, and that's a compound sentence. There is such a thing as a compound complex sentence, where you have one dependent clause and two independent clauses. For example, the girl ran past me, so when I put up my books, I followed her up the hall. The girl ran past me is an independent clause. When I put up my books is a dependent clause, and I followed her up the hall is another independent clause. You can only have two independent clauses at the most. Okay, now we have a slide of review. Please pause the video and try to answer the questions. If you're not sure what the answers are, you can contact me. Let's talk now about the phrase. We mentioned clauses and phrases, and that clauses have a subject and a verb. A phrase does not include a subject and a verb, and that's the big difference between a clause and a phrase. Let's take a look at this sentence. The sweet girl in my British literature class ran across campus to help her fallen friend. There are lots of phrases in here. There's a noun phrase called the sweet girl. That's several words in a row which are functioning as that are helping the noun. The sweet girl is the noun. The girl is the noun, and the sweet help describe the girl. You have prepositional phrases quite often. In fact, this is not the only prepositional phrase in this sentence. In my British literature class, those are prepositional phrases. You do not have a subject and a verb. You just have a preposition, words like in and on and to and after and before. Those are words that are prepositions, and they have to end with some kind of noun or pronoun, and this fits the bill. In my British literature class. Across campus was also another one. Infinitive phrase is to plus a verb, not to plus a noun or pronoun. To is also a preposition, but here you have the infinitive phrase to help. To plus a verb is an infinitive phrase. Now I have some other words here also. To help her fallen friend is the overall idea, but the general infinitive is to plus the verb. You also have something called adjective phrases. This is not in this sentence, but a phrase like very pretty. Pretty is an adjective. Very helps with describe as a describing verb. An adverb phrase like really, slowly. Really and slowly both end in ly. Many adverbs end in ly. That is one way you can tell when something's an adverb. You also have things called verbal phrases that are gerunds, participles, and infinitives. That's the kind of phrase we'll talk about on this slide. I have gerunds in yellow, participles in green, infinitives in blue. So, words that are usually verbs, but are used differently in the sentence are what verbals are. Verbals are not the main verb of the sentence they're being used in. However, on any other sentence, they would be the main verb. Let's see how some of them are. Swimming, in this case, is a gerund. It's acting as a noun. Swimming is my favorite sport. In any other sentence, swimming might have been the verb, the action, something you can do, but in this case, it is not. It is actually the noun, the subject of the sentence. Swimming is. See, is the main verb. Swimming is a verbal. In this case, it's a gerund acting as a noun. Here's another gerund. I like reading, but I have more books than time. Reading, in many cases, is going to be the actual verb, but in this case, it is a noun, something I like. It is something. Like and have are the actual main verbs of the sentence, but reading, in this case, is also a gerund. Participles either end in ed or ing. That's in almost all cases. In this case, a participle acts as an adjective. That's a describing word. Gerunds act as nouns. Participles act as adjectives. What kind of goods? Baked goods. Baked is often a verb in many sentences, but here it is an adjective describing a noun. Baked goods are sold in Carytown. Keep in mind, it's not going to be the main verb of the sentence, but it's going to be a word that acts as a verb many times, but is a describing word. He was relieved to find his missing library book. Here we have was relieved as the main verb, but missing, which often would be a verb, describes the library book. So that would be a participle. Now, I also have put in blue, I don't know if you can tell it, but blue here is an infinitive. You may remember an infinitive is to plus a verb. To find. Find is not the main verb of the sentence. Was relieved as the main verb of the sentence. But to plus a verb is an infinitive. Here we also have an infinitive in to leave, and we have an infinitive in to get in this next one. Okay, here's a review slide. Pause the video and try to identify the bold phrases. Now let's talk about some comma rules. We have 1 and 2 we've talked about. You can have a comma separating dependent and independent clauses if the dependent clause comes first. And in this case, since my baby left me is a dependent clause, it has come first. So when you have that independent clause after that, you put a comma. We've also talked about number 2. As I said, we have independent clause, comma, fanboy conjunction, independent clause. The girl saved her money. She took a trip to Arizona, connected by comma and. When you do have that and, for and nor but are yet so in the middle of the sentence connecting to independent clauses, you do have a comma there. This next one is a common one. Items in a series. I ate this, this, and this, and you separate them by commas. Now, one thing to point out, in recent years, the second comma has been called an Oxford comma and seems to be more optional. So if you see items in a series and the last two do not have a comma separated by them, that has been accepted over the last many years. Also, we are setting off non-essential words by using commas. Here you have this phrase right in the middle of a sentence. Tammy Two-Tone, whose show you like, will host a party today. The main sentence, Tammy Two-Tone will host a party today, is interrupted by a phrase or clause. Of course, you separate them with commas. Same thing here. This is called an appositive when you're redefining what the noun is. Tammy Two-Tone, my cousin, will host a party today. And often you can hear the pause whenever you speak it. Tammy Two-Tone, my cousin, will host a party today, had pauses. And that's one thing that can kind of give you a hint. Also, another non-essential word is when you're addressing someone. John, I think you're wrong. If you had John in the middle of the sentence and you're still addressing him, you would have commas on either side of it. If you had John at the end of the sentence, I think you're wrong, John, you would separate it with a comma. Also, you have quotes and addresses. She said, comma, I don't care. You have a quote here. Even if you had she said in the middle of the quote, you would separate it with commas. And of course, addresses Rome, comma, Georgia. One thing I didn't put on this particular video is numerals like 1,000 after 3 digits. 1, 000 is 1,000. Okay, and we have some a place for you to pause the video and see if you can put the commas in. Finally, we have a list of colons. You might have to pause the video because I'm running short on this. Colons and semicolons are completely different. Colons usually start lists, but notice here they do not interrupt the sentence. Semicolons, we talk about how they take the place of comma fanboys. And I have a note here about numbers. I'm running out of time. Hope this slide will help you learn a little bit about punctuation.